Picture this: a single blade slicing through a floating silk scarf in mid-air, then, in the very next swing, cleaving straight through an enemy's iron helmet without so much as chipping. This was no legend. This was Damascus steel, and for nearly 1,000 years, it was the most feared and coveted material on Earth. The secret to making it died centuries ago, and despite the combined efforts of modern metallurgists, engineers, and scientists armed with electron microscopes and computer simulations, we have only just begun to understand what ancient craftsmen achieved with nothing more than fire, clay, and iron ore. Somewhere in the forested highlands of southern India, more than 2,000 years before the first European ever laid eyes on a Damascus blade, men were digging into the red earth, searching for something precious. Not gold, not silver. Something far more valuable to the warriors of the ancient world: iron ore. But this was not ordinary ore. Hidden within these specific deposits were trace amounts of vanadium, a rare element that would not even be identified by Western science until the 19th century. The miners who pulled this ore from the ground had no concept of vanadium. They did not know its name, could not have described its atomic structure. What they knew was simpler and more profound. Steel made from this earth was different. Steel made from this earth could do things no other steel could do. The crucible process began in small villages scattered across what is now Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, and Andhra Pradesh, a region covering nearly half the size of Europe. The smelters worked in teams, each man understanding his role in an intricate dance that had been passed down through countless generations. They gathered their materials with the precision of alchemists: wrought iron pieces, chips of charcoal, fragments of glass or quartz, and crucially, specific plant matter from the surrounding forests. These plants, unknown to the smelters themselves, contained the vanadium that would make all the difference. They placed these ingredients into small clay crucibles, vessels no larger than a man's fist, crafted from local materials and capable of withstanding temperatures that would turn ordinary pottery to dust. The crucibles were sealed with clay lids, tucked into charcoal furnaces, and heated to temperatures approaching 1,200 degrees Celsius for 8 to 12 hours. What happened inside those sealed vessels was unlike anything else occurring in the metallurgical world at that time. The iron did not simply soften and become workable, it liquefied completely, reaching a fully molten state that would not be achieved in Western steelmaking for more than a millennium. This complete liquefaction was the first secret. As the metal melted, impurities floated to the top, leaving behind steel of exceptional purity. The charcoal dissolved into the iron, raising the carbon content to extraordinary levels between 1.2 and 0%, far higher than any sword steel known to the ancient world. Then came the cooling, and this is where the magic truly began. The furnaces were not quenched or forced to cool rapidly. Instead, the craftsmen allowed the temperature to drop slowly over many hours, letting the metal solidify at its own pace. During this gradual cooling, something remarkable occurred within the steel's crystalline structure. Long plates of cementite, an iron-carbon compound harder than any other phase in the metal, began to segregate themselves. They clustered in bands and sheets, creating a structure invisible to the naked eye, but devastating in its implications for the blade's eventual performance. The vanadium in the ore acted as a catalyst, encouraging the formation of these cementite structures in ways that metallurgists would not fully understand until the late 20th century. When the furnaces finally cooled and the crucibles were broken open, what emerged was a small cake of steel called a Wootz ingot. These ingots, averaging about 2 kilograms each, looked unremarkable to an untrained eye. Rough lumps of grey metal with none of the elegance of the swords they would eventually become. But experienced traders knew their value. Archaeological evidence shows that waste pits near production sites contain thousands of shattered crucible lids, suggesting an industry that operated on an almost assembly line scale. Tens of thousands of these ingots were shipped from India along ancient trade routes, traveling by camel caravan and merchant vessel to destinations across the known world. The Silk Road carried many treasures between East and West: spices, textiles, precious stones. But few commodities were as sought after as Wootz steel. By the 8th century, the ingots were arriving in Persia and Syria in enormous quantities, where they were known as fulad or pulad. The Persian smiths who received these cakes of steel recognized immediately that they held something extraordinary. The metal behaved differently under the hammer. It moved with a fluidity that other steels lacked. And when heated and worked at precisely the right temperatures, it revealed patterns unlike anything else in their forges. Swirling lines that seemed to flow like water across the surface of the metal. The city of Damascus in Syria became the epicenter of a new craft. Though the raw material came from India, it was here that the art of transforming Wootz ingots into legendary blades reached its zenith. The Damascus smiths developed techniques that pushed the limits of what the material could achieve. They discovered that the cementite bands formed during the slow cooling of the original crucible could be manipulated through careful forging. By heating the steel to precisely controlled temperatures and then working it with hammer blows of exact force, they could coax those internal structures into visible patterns on the blade's surface. Too much heat, and the cementite would dissolve back into the steel, erasing the precious banding. Too little heat, and the metal would crack under the hammer. The margin for error was razor thin. The forging temperature had to be maintained between 800 and 1000 degrees Celsius. At this range, the steel remained in its austenite phase, workable, but not so hot that the carbide structures would be destroyed. The smiths judged temperature not with thermometers, which would not be invented for centuries, but with their eyes. They watched the color of the glowing steel in the dim light of the forge, recognizing the precise shade of orange-red that indicated the perfect working temperature. This knowledge could not be written down. It could only be learned through years of observation at the side of a master. The repeated heating and forging cycles served multiple purposes. Each cycle refined the steel's structure, aligning the cementite bands into more regular patterns. The smiths found that with judicious low-temperature forging and repeated anneals, the pale cementite bands could be coaxed into rolling waves, a pattern so hypnotic it seemed almost alive. The blade took shape slowly, over days or even weeks of patient work. Unlike European smiths, who often rushed the process, the Damascus master understood that haste was the enemy of perfection. Each heating, each hammer blow, each moment of cooling brought the sword closer to its ultimate form. The patterns that emerged were given names: ladder patterns, rose patterns, the legendary Muhammad's ladder that seemed to climb the blade like a stairway to heaven. The most prized patterns resembled flowing water, streams and eddies frozen forever in steel. These were not merely decorative. The internal structure that created the visible pattern also gave the blade its supernatural properties. The bands of hard cementite running through a matrix of softer steel created a composite material that combined seemingly contradictory qualities. Extreme hardness at the edge for cutting, combined with flexibility in the body to absorb shock without breaking. Medieval travelers returning from the East brought back tales that seemed impossible. They swore that a Damascus sword could slice a silk kerchief drifting in mid-air, then, without pausing, notch an iron helmet without losing its edge. These stories were not exaggerations. The extraordinary carbon content of Wootz steel, combined with its unique microstructure, produced blades that could be sharpened to an edge measured in nanometers. Modern analysis has revealed that some Damascus blades contain structures resembling carbon nanotubes, materials that 21st century scientists consider among the most advanced on Earth. Ancient smiths had unknowingly created a form of advanced metallurgy that would not be understood until our own era. The fame of Damascus steel exploded during the Crusades. When European knights rode east to reclaim the Holy Land, they encountered an enemy armed with weapons that seemed forged by supernatural forces. The most famous moment came during the Third Crusade, when the forces of Richard the Lionheart faced the army of Saladin al-Ayyubi. Saladin, the Muslim leader who had united much of the Islamic world under his banner, armed his warriors with Damascus blades. The European Crusaders, with their heavy broadswords of inferior steel, found themselves at a devastating disadvantage. Accounts from the period describe Muslim warriors cutting through Crusader swords in single swings, then ripping open their opponent's armor as if it were made of cloth rather than iron. The Crusaders' weapons, considered the finest in Christendom before their departure, proved clumsy and brittle compared to the flowing blades of their enemies. The psychological impact was enormous. Here was proof, in the minds of the superstitious medieval soldier, that God might favor the infidel. Or perhaps they whispered around their campfires, these were demon blades, forged with dark magic in the furnaces of hell. Saladin himself carried a Damascus blade that became legendary in its own right. His armor, helmet and sword were all crafted from the same miraculous steel, making him seem almost invincible on the battlefield. Stories spread of the Sultan demonstrating his blade's sharpness by tossing a silk scarf into the air and allowing it to drift down onto the upturned edge, where it parted in two as if touched by a razor. The European knights wanted these weapons desperately. They were willing to pay enormous sums, but the secrets of Damascus steel remained locked away in the forges of the East. The process of creating a Damascus blade was so demanding that only master smiths who had trained for decades could produce weapons of the highest quality. Guild records from the period indicate that the knowledge was closely guarded, passed from master to apprentice in relationships that often lasted a lifetime. A young man might spend 20 years learning to read the colors of heated steel before he was trusted to forge his first blade. The guilds protected their secrets with religious fervor, understanding that their power depended on maintaining the mystery that surrounded their craft. The forge of a Damascus master was a temple of fire and iron. The largest operations employed dozens of workers, each specializing in a single aspect of the process. Bellows operators maintained precise airflow to the furnaces, controlling temperature with their breath. Apprentices prepared the charcoal, selecting only wood of specific types and ages. Senior journeymen handled the preliminary forging, shaping the rough ingot into a workable billet. And at the center of it all stood the master smith, reading the steel with senses honed by generations of accumulated wisdom. The hammering technique was unlike anything practiced in European forges. Damascus smiths used lighter hammers and faster, more rhythmic strikes. They worked the metal at lower temperatures, accepting slower progress in exchange for finer control over the internal structure. The sound of a Damascus forge was distinctive, a rapid musical percussion rather than the heavy, irregular pounding of Western smithies. Some masters claimed they could judge the progress of a blade by its ring alone, hearing the transformation of the steel's crystalline structure in the changing timbre of each hammer blow. When the blade was fully forged and shaped, it underwent a final treatment that revealed its hidden beauty. The smith polished the surface to a mirror shine, then etched it with dilute acids. The acid attacked the different phases of the steel at different rates. The softer iron dissolved away slightly faster than the hard cementite bands, creating a subtle topography on the blade's surface. When light struck this surface, it reflected differently from the raised and lowered areas, making the internal pattern suddenly visible. The effect was mesmerizing, a flowing landscape of light and shadow that seemed to shift and move as the blade turned. The hilts and fittings of Damascus swords were often as elaborate as the blades themselves. Mughal emperors commissioned daggers with increased blade thickness near the point for penetrating enemy armor, set in gold hilts adorned with emeralds and rubies. Persian nobility favored curved scimitars with intricate calligraphy etched alongside the watered patterns. Some blades bore prayers, others carried the names of their makers, immortalized in steel. A Damascus sword was more than a weapon. It was a work of art, a status symbol, and sometimes an object of almost religious veneration. The peak of Damascus steel production lasted from approximately 900 AD to 1750 AD. During these 8 centuries, the forges of Syria, Persia, and India produced hundreds of thousands of blades, arming the warriors of empires from the Ganges to the Mediterranean. The trade in Wootz ingots and finished swords connected cultures across vast distances, creating economic relationships that shaped the politics of entire regions. Cities grew wealthy from the steel trade. Governments rose and fell based on their ability to control the flow of ingots along the ancient routes. And then, seemingly without warning, the secret was lost. By the mid-18th century, Damascus steel had vanished. The forges went cold. The guilds disbanded. Within a single generation, a craft that had flourished for nearly a millennium simply ceased to exist. The swords that remained became priceless relics, hoarded by collectors and museums. But no new blades emerged to replace those that were lost to war, rust, or time. The most advanced metallurgical technology of the pre-industrial world had disappeared, and no one alive could explain how to recreate it. Several factors contributed to this catastrophic loss. The supply of high-quality Wootz steel from India declined sharply as trade routes collapsed and political upheaval disrupted traditional industries. Colonial interference played a significant role. As British power expanded across the Indian subcontinent, local steel production was suppressed in favor of industrial methods that favored the colonizers' economic interests. The Indian Sepoy Mutiny of 1857 led to deliberate destruction of countless Wootz blades by British forces seeking to disarm the population. Generation after generation of accumulated knowledge, the precise techniques for heating and working the steel, the methods for reading temperature by color and sound, the secrets of the etching process, all of it slipped away as the last masters died without training successors. But there was another factor, one that would not be understood for more than 2 centuries. The ore itself had changed. The specific deposits in southern India that had supplied the vanadium-rich iron for Wootz production became exhausted or inaccessible. Without that crucial trace element, steel produced by the same methods simply did not develop the same internal structure. The smiths of the late period, trying to maintain their craft, found that their blades no longer showed the distinctive patterns that had made Damascus steel famous. They did not understand why. How could they? The role of vanadium in carbide formation would not be discovered until the late 20th century. The ancient masters had relied on ingredients they could not identify, following traditions whose scientific basis remained completely unknown to them. For 200 years, Damascus steel existed only as legend and artifact. Scientists examined surviving blades with increasing fascination as analytical techniques improved. They noted the extraordinary carbon content, far higher than any European steel of comparable age. They observed the unique microstructure under microscopes, seeing carbide bands that no Western process could replicate. But understanding the structure was very different from knowing how to recreate it. The question haunted metallurgists: how had ancient craftsmen, working with tools and knowledge far inferior to modern technology, produced a material that remained beyond our ability to duplicate? The breakthrough came in the late 20th century through the partnership of Dr. J.D. Verhoeven, a metallurgist at Iowa State University, and Alfred Pendray, a Florida blacksmith obsessed with the mystery of Damascus steel. Verhoeven brought the analytical tools of modern science: electron microscopes, spectrometers, computer modeling. Pendray brought something equally valuable: the hands-on experience of a working smith and the patience to fail hundreds of times in pursuit of success. Together, they spent more than a decade analyzing ancient blades and attempting to recreate them. Their analysis revealed the critical role of impurities, specifically the vanadium present at concentrations of approximately 0.005%. This tiny amount, invisible to any analysis available before the 20th century, served as the catalyst for carbide formation. Without it, the cementite structures that gave Damascus steel its properties simply did not develop during cooling. Verhoeven and Pendray sourced iron ore with the appropriate vanadium content and began the painstaking process of reconstruction. The repeated thermal cycling proved equally important. It was not enough to simply melt vanadium-bearing iron and let it cool. The forged billets had to be heated and cooled repeatedly, each cycle encouraging the carbide structures to segregate and align. The smiths discovered that overheating even once could destroy the banding, dissolving the carbides back into solution and requiring the thermal cycling to begin again from scratch. The margin for error that the ancient masters had navigated by instinct, modern researchers could now understand through science, but understanding did not make the task any easier. By the 1990s, Verhoeven and Pendray had succeeded in producing blades with patterns microscopically and visually identical to ancient Damascus steel. They had solved the mystery, but their solution only deepened appreciation for what the original craftsmen had achieved. The ancient masters had optimized a process involving trace elements they could not detect, temperatures they could not measure, and chemical reactions they could not observe. They had done it through nothing but careful observation, relentless experimentation, and the transmission of knowledge across generations. It was one of the most remarkable achievements in the history of materials science, accomplished more than 1,000 years before materials science existed as a discipline. Modern recreations of Wootz steel, though faithful to the ancient process, reveal both the strengths and limitations of the original material. Testing shows that traditional Damascus steel has relatively low toughness compared to modern alloys, a consequence of its extremely high carbon content and banded structure. The same characteristics that give it exceptional hardness and edge retention make it more brittle than contemporary blade steels. Ancient warriors accepted this trade-off, designing fighting techniques around their weapons' characteristics. A Damascus blade could deliver devastating cuts, but it was not designed for the edge-on-edge blocking common in European swordsmanship. The heat treatment of Wootz also presented challenges that ancient smiths solved through methods we can only partially reconstruct. The low hardenability of traditional compositions means that achieving full hardness requires rapid quenching, often in water rather than oil. Many surviving ancient blades show a pearlite microstructure, indicating they were not fully hardened by modern standards, yet they still outperformed contemporary European weapons. The combination of high carbide content and the unique banded structure compensated for what would otherwise be considered suboptimal heat treatment. Contemporary bladesmiths like Spencer Sanderson continue to explore Wootz steel, sometimes adding elements like niobium or chromium to achieve effects similar to the original vanadium. These modern interpretations produce beautiful patterns and functional blades, though purists debate whether they should properly be called Wootz or Damascus steel. The question of definition remains unsettled. Does Wootz refer to a specific composition, a specific process, or simply any steel that develops carbide banding through thermal cycling? German researchers in the 21st century discovered that some Damascus blades contain carbon structures resembling nanotubes and nanowires. These findings suggest that the ancient process achieved results that modern materials science considers cutting-edge technology. The slow cooling, the repeated thermal cycles, the specific chemistry of the original ore, all combined to produce structures that we are only now learning to create through deliberate engineering. The ancient smiths were nanotechnologists without knowing it, manipulating matter at scales invisible to any technology available before the 20th century. The forge fires that once burned across southern India and the workshops of Damascus have been cold for nearly 3 centuries. The guild masters who could judge a blade's quality by its ring have been dust for longer than anyone can remember, but the swords they created remain, preserved in museums and private collections around the world, each one a frozen record of skills that took millennia to develop and mere decades to lose. They remind us that knowledge is fragile, that even the most remarkable achievements can vanish when the chain of transmission is broken. When you see a Damascus blade, whether in a museum case or a modern recreation, you are looking at more than a weapon. You are looking at the culmination of human observation and experimentation stretching back to the Iron Age. You are looking at trade routes that connected civilizations across continents, at secrets guarded by generations of craftsmen, at techniques refined through countless failures. You are looking at steel that once decided the fate of kingdoms, that crusaders dreamed of possessing, that sultans treasured more than gold. The watered patterns flowing across the blade's surface are not decoration. They are the visible signature of a process so complex that modern science required 100 years to understand it. They are the fingerprints of vanadium atoms, clustering in ways that ancient smiths could manipulate but never explain. They are proof that human ingenuity can achieve wonders without comprehending the forces it commands. The secret of Damascus steel was lost once. Through patient research and stubborn determination, we have recovered at least part of what vanished. But the experience should humble us. Our civilization, for all its technology, its electron microscopes and computer models, still struggles to match what craftsmen achieved in clay crucibles heated by charcoal fires. The forgers of Damascus have much to teach us about the nature of knowledge itself, how it is created through generations of accumulated experience, how easily it can be destroyed by disruption and neglect, and how much we lose when we allow ancient wisdom to fade from living memory. The blades remain. They will outlast us all, these frozen rivers of patterned steel, waiting for hands that may never come, keeping their secrets in the crystalline geometry of cementite and iron, whispering of fire and hammer, of masters long dead, of an age when steel was magic and magic was real.